Hello and welcome back to Echoes of Empires. My name is Nick Holmes and this is episode 134 called The Battle of Manzikert. Well, we finally got to what I regard as one of the most decisive battles in history, the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. So let's resume our narrative from episode 132 when we left the Byzantine Emperor Romanus Diogenes in Armenia looking for a decisive victory over the Seljuk Turks, whose spectacular rise to power, as we covered in the last episode, had imperiled the Byzantine Empire. You've heard how Romanus had divided his army, sending a significant force under Trichoniotes to take the fortress of Kliat, while he captured Manzikert. But Trichoniotes had retreated to the west, achieving nothing and leaving Romanus with a depleted army facing the full might of the Seljuks. Yet, on the Turkish side, Alp Arslan was still nervous about a battle, as evidenced by the peace delegation he sent to the Byzantines, which we discussed at the end of the last episode. However, Romanus saw this as a sign of weakness, and it motivated him to fight. Accordingly, on the next day, the 26th of August 1071, Romanus ordered the army to prepare for battle. The troops gathered in the morning, and Romanus addressed them in customary fashion, exhorting them to prepare to die in this decisive battle. According to Attaliates, the Turks watched the Byzantine army assemble with dismay and were so impressed by the sight of the disciplined ranks of Cappadocian and Anatolian soldiers that, quote, they, i.e. the Turks, were inclined to flight when they saw the Roman phalanxes all drawn up in ordered, disciplined battle array. It's open to question how Attaliates knew this, since although he's written our only eyewitness account of the battle, nevertheless he wasn't in the front line, but back in the fortress at Manzikert. However, it's interesting, the Arab sources echo his comments that the Turks were intimidated by the Byzantine formations. Indeed, they claim Alp Arslan was preparing to die in battle. According to them, he dressed in white so that his garb might serve as his shroud should he die, and he made his entourage swear to recognize his son, Malik Shah, as his heir. Then he made an impassioned speech to his army. Quote, no matter how few we may be, and no matter how great in numbers the Romans may be, I shall fling myself upon the enemy at this hour when the Muslims are praying for us. Either I shall be victorious and fulfill my goal, or I shall be a martyr and enter paradise. Those who desire to follow me, come with me. Those who wish to go back may do so freely. There is here no sultan commanding, and no soldier being commanded, for I am today only one of you. While this passage was written a century after the battle and contains almost absurd poetic hyperbole, Alp Arslan was genuinely probably nervous. Defeat by the Byzantines would jeopardize his authority over the Turkmen, and his entire empire could easily unravel if Romanus won a victory. Turning to the Seljuk army, it's likely to have mainly comprised the same Turkmen who'd been living along the Armenian border and raiding Byzantine territory. It almost certainly also included Alp Arslan's bodyguard and elite troops, the slave soldiers called gulams, so popular in the Islamic world. No source mentions its size, but most historians estimate it was substantial, perhaps around 30,000 strong. Alp Arslan appointed one of his most trusted generals, a eunuch called Turangiz, to set about organising the Turkmen into a crescent formation facing the Byzantines, so they could harry them with arrows and lure them into making charges, whereupon they'd employ the usual Turkish tactic of retreating and shooting arrows behind them and avoiding a pitched battle unless an opportunity presented itself. On the Byzantine side, their battle order wasn't typical of the formations favoured by the Byzantine military manuals. These would have had infantry in the centre and cavalry on the wings, but Romanus was a very experienced general, familiar with fighting steppe nomads, and he knew that a conventional approach was impractical against the hit-and-run tactics of the Seljuks. So he divided his army into 4 separate and self-sufficient battle groups, each containing a mix of infantry, heavy cavalry, archers, and Pecheneg and Oguz auxiliaries. As already discussed, there were no Frankish cavalry at the battle, since these had been sent to Cleat, and I think the same was true of the Varangians. The great advantage of Romanus's battle plan was flexibility. By making his generals independent, they could respond to the Turkish nomad tactics in the way they thought best. However, there was one major disadvantage. By giving them independence, he lost much of his own control over the army. Successful coordination was therefore required between the battle groups, and communication was always a weakness in armies before the modern era of wireless technology. And most important of all was a spectacular miscalculation Romanus made about one of his generals, Andronicus Ducas, the son of his arch-rival Caesar John, because he made a fatal mistake by putting Andronicus in command of the rearguard with a mixed force of mercenaries and Byzantines. As I mentioned in episode 132, it remains a mystery why Romanus did this when he'd placed his father under house arrest. My sense is, first, the Ducas family was still popular, and he didn't want to seem too harsh by imprisoning or executing them. Second, Andronicus was in effect a hostage he took on campaign to ensure Caesar John's good behaviour. And third, he thought the rearguard was the place where Andronicus could do him least harm. So I'm sure Romanus thought it was a clever ploy to take Andronicus with him. Romanus himself took command of the centre, which was almost certainly the powerhouse of the army, filled with the elite Cappadocian regiments. On the right wing, he put one of his closest supporters, Theodore Aliates, a Cappadocian aristocrat. On the left wing, the Western army was led by Nicephorus Bryennius, who wasn't a die-hard supporter of Romanus's, but Romanus probably judged the Western army would be loyal to him since, as I've mentioned before, he'd been one of its most popular generals before he became emperor, and the soldiers had sworn an oath of loyalty to him. Choking in the dust, kicked up by the huge numbers of horses' hooves, emphasised by the Arab sources, the Byzantine battle groups marched across the plain towards the Seljuk camp some 5 miles away. The 2 main Byzantine accounts of the battle paint contrasting pictures of what happened next. On the one hand, Taliates says the Turks melted away without fighting, quote, inclined to flight when they saw the Roman phalanxes all drawn up in ordered, disciplined battle array. However, our other main source, who was Nicephorus Bryennius's grandson, also called Bryennius, and who I'll refer to as Bryennius Jr., says the advance was much more difficult, and the Seljuk general Tarangiz, quote, divided his army into several groups, set traps and organised ambushes, and ordered his men to surround the Byzantines and riddle them with arrows. The Byzantines, seeing their cavalry under attack, were obliged to follow it, which they did, while the enemy pretended to flee. But, falling victim to the traps and ambushes, they suffered great losses. I suspect Bryennius Jr.'s account is the more accurate, since his grandfather was, of course, in the thick of the fighting and might well have left records of the battle. In contrast, as I've mentioned, Taliates wasn't in the front line and was back at camp. But even if we take Bryennius Jr.'s account as the most credible, there's no doubt Romanus was winning and the Seljuks were retreating. Taliates says he advanced for several miles until, in the evening he became worried that the Turks might outflank him and attack the Byzantine camp, which was poorly defended, quote, stripped bare of soldiers, including foot sentries. Therefore, he halted the centre and ordered the signal to be given to those on the wings to turn around and head back to camp. Romanus must have felt frustrated he hadn't secured a decisive victory, but he had at least pushed the Seljuks back several miles, and he could rightfully claim they were afraid of a pitched battle. But it was then that things went disastrously wrong for Romanus. As I've already mentioned, battlefield communications were always a critical weakness for armies before the modern era. In the Byzantine army, the order to return to camp was given by reversing the imperial battle standards. The problem was this signal could be misunderstood. And on this occasion, it seems that happened because the soldiers on both wings weren't sure why the banners in the centre had been reversed. This facilitated the fatal act of treachery by Andronicus Ducas, which sealed Romanus's fate. Ataliates has left us with a detailed description which is worth quoting in full. He, i.e. Romanus, ordered the imperial banner to be turned around as a signal for the troops to return to camp. But when those soldiers who were far away from the main body saw the imperial banner being turned around, they thought the emperor had fallen in defeat. Many relate that one of those who was waiting for a chance to get at him, a cousin of the emperor's stepson Michael, and here Ataliates is referring to Andronicus Ducas, but he's not saying it openly, who had previously plotted against him, spread this report among the soldiers. He, i.e. Andronicus, quickly got his men together, for the emperor, with his good heart, had entrusted a large contingent to this man's command, and fled back to the camp. The nearest units followed his example, and one by one they turned to flight without a fight, and others followed after them. When the emperor saw this irrational flight and desertion, he took a stand with his own men, trying in the usual way to check the flight of his men, but nobody was listening to him. End quote. So, Ataliates makes it absolutely clear Romanus was betrayed by Andronicus, and Andronicus's treachery created exactly the opportunity Alp Arslan had been waiting for. Victory for the Seljuks hinged on their knack for capitalizing on confusion during combat. Alp Arslan ordered an all-out attack. The mass of Seljuk horsemen facing the Byzantines stopped retreating, drew their sabres and maces, and charged. So Romanus had got the pitched battle he wanted. But with the bulk of his army fleeing the field, the result was chaos, and the situation quickly turned against the Byzantines. On the right wing, the Seljuks furiously attacked Aliates' battle group, which broke up. The centre, under Romanus' command, held firm, but was surrounded. In my opinion, Andronicus' rearguard could have saved the day if it had intervened and rescued Romanus. Indeed, I think it could have done more than that, and it might even have achieved a resounding victory if it had trapped and surrounded the Turks who were encircling the Byzantine centre. But it did the opposite, fleeing the battlefield as fast as possible and contributing to the chaos. The Western army on the left wing, led by Bryennius, was holding its own against the Turks as it retreated in good order. Bryennius Jr. claims it tried but failed to come to the emperor's help. However, his description, written 50 years after the battle, looks to me more like an attempt to flatter his grandfather's memory, since we know the Western army survived Manzikert largely intact, suggesting it didn't try too hard to save Romanus. We can assume that although Bryennius Sr. wasn't a downright traitor, he felt limited loyalty to Romanus. Romanus was now in a truly desperate situation. With 2 of his 4 battle groups withdrawing from the battlefield, he was completely surrounded. Aleates' soldiers on the right wing were the only ones who genuinely tried to rescue him, but they faced the full brunt of the Turkish attack and were pushed back. Romanus fought like a lion. Not a single source, Byzantine or Muslim, pro-Romanus or anti-Romanus, refrains from praising him as a hero. Refusing to give up, he tried to fight his way back to Manzikert. The battle wore on into the evening. Alp Arslan concentrated all his soldiers on stopping Romanus from escaping. Finally, with his horse shot dead by an arrow and wounded in the hand so that he couldn't hold a sword, Romanus surrendered. Back in the Byzantine camp, panic reigned. The fleeing troops clustered outside the camp palisade. No one knew what had happened. Some said Romanus had been killed, while others said he'd defeated the Turks. Groups of retreating soldiers suddenly appeared and then vanished. Aleates says he tried to stop them, but even some of Romanus's loyal Cappadocian soldiers ran away. He says a large group of Byzantine horsemen appeared, and we don't know who they were, but my guess is they were probably a unit of the Western army, and said they thought the emperor might be dead. Confusion reigned. After the Turks arrived, it was everyone for himself. Aleates described the chaos vividly. Quote, "It was like an earthquake, with howling, grief, sudden fear, clouds of dust, and finally hordes of Turks riding all around us. The enemy chased us, killing some, capturing some, and trampling others underfoot." End quote. The broken right wing of the army, commanded by Aleates, fled in disorder, pursued by the Turks. Even some of the Cappadocian soldiers in the centre appear to have abandoned the emperor. Quote, "Finally, many of the Cappadocians who were with the emperor, one group after another, began to desert." Meanwhile, the traitor Andronicus sped back to Constantinople as fast as his horse could carry him, not having drawn a sword. Tricaniotes was also already hundreds of miles to the west, his force of Varangians and Normans intact. The Western army under Nicephorus Bryennius was also retreating, and no doubt after suffering some casualties, but it was still nevertheless largely in one piece. Back on the battlefield, Romanus and his remaining Cappadocians fought on. They must have made a miserable sight, with corpses littering the ground, men screaming in agony from their wounds, horses neighing in their death throes, and blood soaking the ground. By nightfall, the last survivors of the Byzantine centre surrendered. Romanus's defeat at Manzikert quickly passed into legend. Forever afterwards, the Byzantines themselves referred to it as the Dreadful Day, all too aware of its ominous significance. The battle is equally revered in Islamic folklore. Today, the Turkish President Recep Erdogan marks its anniversary with one of the largest national celebrations in modern Turkey. Romanus's surrender is also steeped in Islamic myth. Muslim chroniclers delighted in telling a tale that became legendary, that a lowly slave soldier, a ghulam, took Romanus prisoner. Many versions of the story exist, and although the details vary, they all agree that as this simple soldier was about to kill Romanus, he suddenly realized who he was. Some say the ghulam spoke Greek, and Romanus told him, quote, "Hold your sword, for I am the Emperor of the Romans." Others say the ghulam saw his gilded armour and realised he was a nobleman. Whatever the details of the various stories, the Islamic message is always the same. Islam humbles the proud. But aside from this symbolism, there was an undeniably practical truth. Romanus's plans to save Byzantium had been shattered. The army he'd painstakingly created over the last 3 years had been routed and destroyed. He himself was a prisoner, and the first emperor to be taken prisoner for nearly 3 centuries. However, there were plenty of surprises to follow. First, Alp Arslan was astonishingly lenient towards Romanus. He didn't realise he'd captured him until the next day. When he was brought before him, he still couldn't believe it was the emperor. He had his identity checked with the other Byzantine prisoners. Still distrustful, he asked the peace envoys he'd sent to Romanus only 2 days before to confirm it really was him. Once he was sure the blooded, wounded soldier kneeling before him was the Roman emperor, he stood up from his throne and walked towards him. Romanus must have expected the worst. The last Byzantine emperor to be captured had been beheaded, and his skull made into a drinking cup. But to everyone's astonishment, Alp Arslan hauled him to his feet and offered him his hand in friendship. His chivalrous behaviour to Romanus counts as one of the most unexpected and extraordinary twists in the whole story of Manzikert. Like the legend of Romanus's capture by the slave soldier, it became legendary across Islam as a symbol of Islamic chivalry. And it appears to be true, since every account of Manzikert, both Byzantine and Arab, including that left by Ataliates, tells the same story. Alp Arslan made a point of treating Romanus honourably. He said the battle had been too close to call and that it could easily have gone the other way had Romanus not been betrayed. In particular, he admired Romanus's bravery in adversity, both in the battle itself and when he stood powerless before him. The story told in most accounts is that when Alp Arslan asked Romanus what he would have done had he won the battle, Romanus looked at him defiantly and said, quote, "If I took you prisoner, I would prepare a dog's collar for you," whereupon the Sultan smiled and said, quote, "You're lucky, for I won't imitate your severity or harshness." So why was Alp Arslan so lenient? The answer, I think, was that it suited him politically. Firstly, his objective was to conquer Egypt, not Byzantium, and it suited him well to have Byzantium as a vassal. Secondly, he did demand some major concessions, including a huge ransom and ongoing tribute. However, he was relaxed about them, and in fact they were never enforced. The truth was he wanted Romanus back on the throne as quickly as possible, since he'd established a good relationship with him. Both men knew Romanus's future was very uncertain. Therefore the Sultan released him after only 8 days in captivity and sent him back with the other Byzantine prisoners, including Nicephorus Basilakes, who you'll recall had been captured before the battle. But he wasn't released quickly enough, since back in Constantinople the Ducas family had already staged their coup. When news of Romanus's defeat reached the city, Caesar John crowned Eudocia's first son Michael as emperor. As I've mentioned before, he was born to the previous emperor Constantine X and was a weak-willed and ineffectual young man who nobody took seriously, but he was now around 20 years old, so old enough at least to be made emperor. Our sources are confusing about how much Eudocia tried to protect Romanus, but I think it's clear she protested until she was led away at sword point by the Varangian guard and banished. I'll be brief about the civil war that followed. In short, Romanus led the remains of his army towards Constantinople in an attempt to seize the capital, but the Ducas family defeated it with the help of Norman mercenaries. Romanus surrendered on condition he become a monk, and his safety was guaranteed. Unfortunately for him, he made another fatal mistake in trusting the Ducas family. The moment they had him in their grasp, he was led away and pinned down while a poker was driven into his eyes as he screamed. Ataliates describes the horrific scene. Quote, "They put him in a small room and tied down his 4 limbs, and many men held him down with shields on his chest and stomach. Then they used an iron pin to destroy his eyes in an extremely painful and cruel way, while he roared and bellowed like a bull, though no one took pity on him. When he arose, his eyes were drenched with blood, a pitiable and pathetic sight that made everyone who saw it cry uncontrollably." With his horrific injuries, he was mocked and carried backwards on a donkey. He died shortly afterwards from the wounds of his brutal blinding, as Ataliates tells us, quote, like a rotting corpse with his eyes gouged out, his head all swollen up and maggots visibly dropping off. A few days later, he died in excruciating pain. It was as tragic a death as anyone could imagine. The hero of Byzantium, who genuinely wanted to save the empire from the Turks, was brutally betrayed and murdered by the jealous Ducas family. In my view, it wasn't the Turks who destroyed Byzantium, but Caesar John and his son Andronicus. Between them, they extinguished the last hope for the empire that was the heir to Rome. The chronicler Ataliates called for divine revenge on them. Quote, one way or another, a day will come when an evil eye, titanic and Cronian, will turn its gaze upon you and push your fortunes to the same evil fate. Ataliates' words would prove to be true, not just for the Ducas family, but for the whole of Byzantium. And with Byzantium's collapse, the first vital step had been taken on the path that would ultimately lead to the Crusades. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. On August the 29th, we'll continue with the story of Byzantium's collapse after Manzikert and the rise to power of a man who would ultimately save it from annihilation, a man who would become one of the most famous of all Byzantine emperors, Alexius Comnenus. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my mailing list where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening and see you next time.